The outcome was set the moment tanks entered the desert, not because they were poorly built, but because they were built for somewhere else. At the time, the belief was simple. Stronger armor and bigger guns would decide the fight, and the desert was seen as open space, flat ground between targets. That belief broke down quickly. Tracks sank instead of gripping, engines overheated before combat even began, and sand crept into moving parts, wearing them down hour by hour. The first losses were not from enemy fire. They were from heat, dust, and ground that refused to hold weight. In the desert, machines do not decide the battle. The conditions do. Most people think tank battles come down to who has thicker armor or a bigger gun. That makes sense on paper. But in the desert, none of that matters first. What matters is whether your tank can move at all. Sand decides where you go, how fast you get there, and whether your engine survives long enough to let you fight. It is not dramatic. It is mechanical, and it catches armies off guard every single time. I used to think deserts were simple battlefields, wide open spaces, clear lines of sight, room to maneuver. That's how they look on maps. But maps don't show you what sand actually does under 50 tons of steel. They don't show the way it shifts, collapses, or turns solid ground into something closer to liquid. Deserts aren't open terrain. They're unstable terrain. And that instability doesn't care how advanced your tank is. When a tank rolls across grass or dirt, the ground pushes back. It holds. In sand, the ground gives way. It sinks under pressure. It moves. And when it moves, everything about how that tank was designed to operate starts falling apart. You can have the best crew in the world. You can have a machine built to punch through concrete. But if the sand decides your tracks are going to dig in instead of grip, you're not going anywhere. This isn't about bad luck. It's about physics. Sand behaves differently than solid ground, and tanks are built with solid ground in mind. The engineers who design them test them on dirt, gravel, mud. They account for weight distribution and traction, but sand doesn't follow the same rules. It doesn't compress cleanly. It doesn't stay where you put it. And once you start moving heavy armor across it, the problems don't just appear. They multiply. What looks like flat, empty desert can behave like soft snow the moment a tank tries to cross it. Tracks that work perfectly on European fields start spinning. Engines that run cool in moderate climates start overheating. Filters that last weeks somewhere else get clogged in hours. And all of this happens before a single shot is fired. The environment becomes the first opponent, and it doesn't lose often. Once you understand that the ground controls everything, you start seeing why desert warfare is so different. It's not just another battlefield with sand instead of grass. It's a place where basic assumptions about how tanks work stop being reliable. Sand looks simple. It's just tiny grains of rock, right? But under the weight of a tank, it stops acting like solid ground and starts acting like something else entirely. It shifts. It flows. It refuses to hold weight the way dirt or grass would. And that difference, small as it sounds, changes everything about how armor moves. When a tank rolls over soil, the ground compresses, the weight pushes down, the earth pushes back, and the tank keeps moving. Traction happens because the surface stays mostly stable. But sand doesn't compress the same way. It moves out from under the tracks. It redistributes. And when that happens, the tank doesn't get the grip it needs. Instead of forward motion, you get spinning tracks. Instead of movement, you get digging. The finer the sand, the worse this gets. Coarse sand has some structure to it. The grains lock together just enough to provide a little resistance. But fine desert sand, the kind that covers huge stretches of places like North Africa or the Middle East, behaves almost like powder. It flows around obstacles. It fills in gaps instantly. And when a tank tries to push through it, the sand doesn't fight back. It just keeps moving, and the tank sinks deeper with every attempt to break free. This isn't a rare problem. It's expected. Any military force planning to operate in desert conditions has to assume that vehicles will get stuck. Not might. Will. And when a 70-ton machine buries itself in sand, you can't just push it out. You need recovery vehicles, winches, time, and crew who aren't getting shot at while they work. Some operations have had to abandon tanks entirely because pulling them out would take too long or cost too many lives. Then there's what sand does when it gets inside the tank. And it always gets inside. Fine particles work their way into every gap, every seal, every moving part. They get into the suspension, they get into the engine, they get into the turret ring, and once they're in, they act like grinding paste. Metal wears down faster. Parts that should last months start failing in weeks. Maintenance schedules that were designed for European campaigns become completely inadequate. You can see a flat stretch of desert and assume it is easy ground to cross. But sand does not care what it looks like. It cares about weight, pressure, and movement. And when those three things come together under a tank, the ground stops cooperating. That is when the tracks start fighting back. Tracks are supposed to distribute weight. That is the whole point. Instead of all the pressure going through four wheels like a car, the load spreads across a long surface. This is what lets tanks cross mud, climb hills, and push through obstacles. But in sand, that advantage starts turning into a problem. Sand does not just sit there, it moves. And when tracks start sinking, they do not stop on their own. Wide tracks help. They spread the weight over a larger area, which reduces ground pressure. A tank with wide tracks has a better chance of staying on top of loose sand instead of digging into it. But wide tracks are not a perfect solution. They add weight. They make the tank harder to transport. And in certain types of sand, even wide tracks will eventually sink if the vehicle stays in one place too long or tries to make sharp turns. Narrow tracks are worse. They concentrate pressure into a smaller area, which means the sand gives way faster. Tanks designed for European forests or urban combat often have narrower tracks because they do not need as much surface area on solid ground. But take those same machines into a desert, and they start struggling immediately. The tracks bite into the sand instead of riding on top of it. Forward movement becomes harder. Fuel consumption goes up because the engine has to work harder. And if the tank stops moving, it starts sinking. Sharp turns make everything worse. When a tank pivots, one track has to reverse while the other keeps moving forward. On solid ground, this works fine. In sand, it grinds the reversing track straight down into the surface. The tank does not turn cleanly, it digs a trench. And if the crew keeps trying to force the turn, they can bury the vehicle deep enough that it becomes completely immobilized. Recovery crews have found tanks sitting in craters they created themselves, with tracks buried down to their axles, going nowhere. Getting stuck is not embarrassing. It is tactically dangerous. A stuck tank cannot retreat. It cannot reposition. It becomes a stationary target, and in open desert, that is often fatal. The crew either has to abandon the vehicle or wait for recovery, and both options put lives at risk. Some militaries started deploying recovery vehicles alongside combat units, specifically because they knew tanks would get stuck regularly. Those recovery vehicles became just as important as the tanks themselves. Without them, entire formations could grind to a halt. Sand does not just make movement harder, it turns tracks into tools that work against the tank. Every attempt to move forward can make things worse. And while the crew is dealing with that, the engine is dealing with something even more destructive. Engines need air. That's not optional. They pull air in, mix it with fuel, and burn it to create power. In most environments, air filters catch dust and debris before it reaches the engine. But in the desert, the air is not just dusty, it is thick with sand. Sand is fine enough to get past filters that were designed for normal dirt. Sandstorms pick that sand up. Air intakes on tanks are positioned to avoid sucking in debris from the ground, but in a desert, sand is not just on the ground. Wind picks it up, movement kicks it up. Sandstorms turn the entire atmosphere into a cloud of abrasive particles, and all of that gets pulled straight into the engine. Filters are supposed to catch it, but desert sand is so fine and so constant that filters clog faster than anyone expected. During some conflicts, tank crews had to clean air filters every day, not every week, every day. In heavy sandstorms or during long operations, they sometimes cleaned them multiple times a day. If they did not, airflow dropped, the engine started running poorly, and eventually it would overheat or stall completely. Some crews carried extra filters because they knew the originals would not last. Others improvised by wrapping intakes in cloth or mesh. That helped a little, but it also restricted airflow and reduced engine performance. Once sand gets past the filters, it goes straight into the combustion chamber. It mixes with fuel and air, and then it burns. Sand does not burn cleanly. It leaves residue. It scratches cylinder walls and grinds down piston rings. Over time, this causes compression loss, oil leaks, and power drops. Engines that should run for thousands of hours start failing after hundreds. And when an engine fails in the middle of a desert, that tank is done. Overheating becomes constant. Engines generate heat, and cooling systems are designed to handle that under normal conditions. But deserts are not normal conditions. Ambient temperatures can hit 110 to 140 degrees Fahrenheit. Cooling systems that work fine in Europe or North America struggle when the outside air is already hot. Radiators cannot dissipate heat as efficiently. Coolant temperatures rise. And if the engine is already working harder because of clogged filters or poor traction, it generates even more heat than usual. Some tanks started overheating even when idling. Crews would shut engines off whenever possible to let them cool, but that meant losing power to electronics, radios, and turret systems. It also meant the tank could not move quickly if it needed to. So crews had to choose between risking engine damage or risking tactical disadvantage. Neither option was good. Sand does not just make engines work harder. It gets inside them and tears them apart from within. And while the engine is struggling to survive, the heat is doing something worse to everything else. Deserts do not just get warm, they get hot enough to hurt. Daytime temperatures in places like Iraq, Libya, or the Sinai regularly exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Metal surfaces in direct sunlight can reach 160 degrees or higher. And inside a tank, where armor traps heat and engines generate more, temperatures climb even further. Crews have reported interior temperatures above 140 degrees. That is not uncomfortable. That is dangerous. Engines are designed to operate within a specific temperature range. When ambient temperatures are already near the top of that range, there is no margin left. Cooling systems run at maximum capacity constantly. Radiators work harder. Coolant circulates faster. And if anything in that system fails, even slightly, the engine overheats. Once that happens, performance drops. Power output falls. And if the temperature keeps climbing, the engine shuts down entirely to avoid catastrophic damage. But engines are not the only thing affected by heat. Electronics. degrade faster in high temperatures. Solder joints can crack, capacitors fail, wiring insulation breaks down. Tanks built in the 1960s and the 1970s, before modern heat-resistant components, had constant electrical problems in deserts. Radios stopped working. Fire control systems malfunctioned. Even basic gauges became unreliable. Crews could not trust their instruments, which meant they had to rely on instinct and guesswork during combat. Hydraulic systems suffer too. Hydraulic fluid thins out in high heat, which reduces pressure and makes systems sluggish. Turrets rotate slower. Gun elevation mechanisms respond poorly. Suspension components that rely on hydraulics start behaving unpredictably. And if the fluid gets hot enough, seals start leaking. Once that happens, the system loses pressure entirely, and repairs require parts that might not be available in the field. Fuel consumption goes up. Cooling systems use power. Running fans and pumps at maximum constantly drains fuel faster than normal. And in a desert, fuel logistics are already difficult. Supply lines are long. Roads are rough or non-existent. Every extra gallon of fuel a tank burns means another truck has to make a dangerous trip to resupply it. Some units ran out of fuel, not because they traveled too far, but because their tanks burned through it just trying to stay cool. Crews face the worst of it. Heat exhaustion sets in fast. Decision-making slows. Reaction times drop. Crews become irritable, disoriented, and in extreme cases, incapacitated. Tanks carry water, but it is never enough when temperatures are that high. Dehydration becomes a constant threat. And if a crew is too exhausted to operate effectively, the tank's firepower and armor do not matter. The machine is only as effective as the people inside it. Heat does not just make desert combat harder, it changes what is possible. Systems that work perfectly in cooler climates start failing. Performance drops across the board. And while heat is tearing machines and people apart, there is another problem developing. That problem makes all of this even worse. You can have the best equipment in the world, but if you cannot see the enemy, none of it matters. Deserts look empty, wide, flat, open. You'd think visibility would be perfect, but it is not. Sand and heat both distort vision in ways that make targeting difficult and sometimes impossible. The openness becomes deceptive. You can see for miles, but what you are seeing is not always accurate. Sandstorms are the most obvious problem. When wind picks up, it lifts sand into the air and turns the atmosphere opaque. Visibility can drop to a few meters, sometimes less. Tank crews cannot see other vehicles in their own formation, let alone enemy positions. Driving becomes dangerous because obstacles are hidden. Navigation then relies entirely on instruments, and if those instruments fail, units get lost. Some sandstorms last for hours. During that time, combat operations stop completely. You are blind, and so is everyone else. But even on clear days, vision is not reliable. Heat haze distorts everything. Hot air rising from the ground bends light, creating mirages and making distant objects shimmer and warp. Rangefinders struggle. Optical sights become less accurate. What looks like a tank at 2,000 meters might actually be at 2,500 meters, or it might not be a tank at all. Gunners have to account for distortion when aiming, and there is no consistent formula. It changes with temperature, time of day, and terrain. Dust clouds reveal positions. Every time a tank moves, it kicks up dust. In dry desert conditions, that dust hangs in the air and drifts with the wind. It is visible from kilometers away. A single vehicle moving fast can create a plume that marks its location for anyone watching. Entire formations create dust clouds so large they are visible from aircraft. This makes stealth almost impossible. The act of moving gives you away. Firing makes it worse. When a tank fires its main gun, the blast kicks up an enormous cloud of dust and sand around the vehicle. For a few seconds, the crew is blind. They cannot see if they hit the target. They cannot see if return fire is coming. And everyone nearby now knows exactly where that tank is. Some crews would fire once and then immediately reposition, knowing that staying in place after revealing themselves is suicidal. But repositioning creates more dust, which keeps the cycle going. Thermal imaging helps, but it is not perfect. Modern tanks use thermal sights to see through dust and haze by detecting heat signatures. This works well at night and in poor visibility. But during the day, when everything is hot, thermal imaging becomes less effective. The ground radiates heat. Rocks radiate heat. Disabled vehicles radiate heat. Distinguishing between a running engine and sun-baked metal becomes difficult. False positives increase. Gunners waste time tracking targets that are not real. The desert promises clear lines of sight, but it does not deliver them. Visibility becomes unreliable. Targeting becomes harder. And every attempt to move or fight reveals your position to anyone paying attention. Armor and firepower matter, but only if you can see what you are shooting at, and only if the enemy cannot see you first. These problems forced engineers to rethink how tanks should be built, because the machines that worked everywhere else were not working here.
For decades, tanks were designed for Europe. That made sense. The Cold War focused on the possibility of massive armored battles across the plains of Germany, through French forests, and across Polish fields. Engineers optimized for mud, rain, moderate temperatures, and solid ground. Desert performance was not a priority because deserts were not where the fighting was expected to happen. But conflicts in the Middle East changed that. Tanks that performed well in Europe struggled badly in sand and heat. Engines overheated, filters clogged, tracks sank. Militaries began to realize their multi-million-dollar machines were not as versatile as they thought. Desert warfare was no longer a fringe scenario. It was real, it was recurring, and it was exposing weaknesses that could not be ignored. Air filtration became a design priority. Older tanks had basic filters that caught only large debris, and that was not good enough for desert sand. Engineers developed larger, multi-stage filtration systems to handle finer particles and much higher volumes of dust. Some designs added pre-filters to catch the worst of it before air reached the main filter. Others used cyclonic separators to spin heavy particles out of the airflow so they could not clog the system. These systems were bulkier and more complex, but they worked. Cooling systems got more attention. Radiators were enlarged, and coolant capacity increased. Some tanks added auxiliary cooling fans that could be turned on during extreme heat. Others redesigned engine compartments to improve airflow and heat dissipation. The goal was not just to prevent overheating, it was to keep engines running efficiently in temperatures that would normally cause shutdowns. That required more weight, more maintenance, and more potential points of failure. But without better cooling, tanks could not operate in deserts for extended periods. Maintenance access improved. Older tanks assumed maintenance would happen in rear areas with proper facilities. In deserts, you do not always have that luxury. Crews needed to access filters, check fluids, and replace parts quickly in the field. Engineers began designing larger hatches, easier panels, and built-in tool storage with this in mind. Components that once took hours to reach were repositioned. Service intervals were adjusted to match desert conditions rather than European ones. reliability stopped being a secondary concern. It became as important as firepower. A tank that breaks down in the middle of a desert is worse than useless. It is a liability. Crews must protect it or abandon it. Recovery teams must risk themselves to pull it out. Supply lines become strained while trying to deliver parts. Unreliable tanks do more than reduce combat effectiveness. They create cascading logistical problems that affect entire units. None of these changes were optional. Real combat proved that. Tanks built without desert adaptations failed in the field. Units equipped without those adaptations suffered higher loss rates, not because of enemy fire, but because their machines could not handle the environment. These lessons did not come from testing ranges. They came from wars that were already happening. The Middle East became a testing ground. Not intentionally, not by choice. Conflicts in places like the Sinai, Iraq, and the Gulf exposed which tanks worked and which did not. Armies did not have the luxury of pulling back and redesigning everything. They had to adapt on the move, in the field, under fire. The tanks that survived were not always the ones with the thickest armor or the biggest guns. They were the ones that kept running. Israeli forces in the Sinai during the 1960s and the 1970s learned this the hard way. Tanks that performed well in Europe struggled in the desert. Air filters clogged constantly. Engines overheated. Tracks sank in soft sand. Crews had to improvise solutions because official support could not keep up. They modified air intakes. They changed maintenance routines. They learned which terrain to avoid and which routes gave their tanks the best chance of staying mobile. These were not official doctrines. They were survival tactics. The Gulf War in 1991 showed the difference preparation made. Coalition forces brought tanks specifically adapted for desert conditions. Air filtration systems were upgraded before deployment. Cooling systems were reinforced. Maintenance schedules were adjusted to account for sand and heat. These machines did not break down nearly as often as earlier generations had. They stayed operational longer. They required less recovery support. That reliability translated directly into combat effectiveness. Iraqi forces, by contrast, fielded tanks that were not designed for prolonged desert operations. Many were Soviet-built models optimized for European warfare. Their air filters could not handle the fine sand. Their cooling systems struggled in the heat. When coalition air superiority made resupply and maintenance nearly impossible, those tanks started failing even without being hit. Crews abandoned vehicles that were mechanically dead but structurally intact. The environment finished what combat started. Many units were effectively abandoned on the battlefield. Crews became experts in field modifications. They learned to wrap air intakes in cloth to pre-filter sand. They carried extra oil and coolant because they knew they would need it. They developed techniques for extracting stuck vehicles using other tanks, ropes, and improvised anchors. Some units welded additional storage onto their tanks just to carry more filters and spare parts. None of this was in the manuals. It came from experience, from watching machines fail, from trial and error under pressure. Field crews learned to improvise to keep moving. The most successful tanks were not the fanciest. They were not the fastest or the most heavily armed. They were the ones that kept running, the ones that did not need constant repairs, the ones that could operate for days in heat and sand without breaking down. Reliability became the difference between effective units and ones that spent more time fixing equipment than fighting. These lessons did not stay in the desert. They fed back into tank design programs around the world. Engineers studied after-action reports. They interviewed crews. They analyzed failure rates and maintenance logs. And they started building machines that assumed harsh environments by default, not as an edge case. Deserts were not rare battlefields anymore. They were real.
They were recurring, and they were not getting any easier. Modern tank design no longer assumes ideal conditions. Engineers now expect sand, heat, dust, and all the problems that come with them. These are not special features added later. They are baked into the design from the start. Tanks built in the 2000s and beyond reflect decades of hard lessons learned in deserts where older machines failed. Air filtration systems are now larger and redundant. Instead of a single filter that clogs and kills the engine, modern tanks often have multi-stage systems with pre-filters, main filters, and sometimes backup filters. Some designs use cyclonic separators to remove the heaviest particles before air reaches the filter media. This redundancy means that even if one stage fails, the engine still has protection. It also means longer intervals between filter changes, which reduces maintenance burden in the field. Filters are now treated as mission critical. Cooling and thermal management are core features, not afterthoughts. Radiators are bigger, coolant systems have higher capacity, and engine compartments are designed with better airflow. Some tanks have active cooling systems that adjust based on temperature sensors, increasing fan speed or redirecting airflow when heat builds up. This is not just about preventing overheating. It is about maintaining consistent performance across a wide temperature range. An engine that runs efficiently at 120 degrees Fahrenheit is far more useful than one that barely functions. Cooling is built in from day one. Electronics and hydraulics are built to tolerate heat. Components are heat-resistant by default. Wiring uses insulation that does not degrade as quickly. Solder joints are stronger. Hydraulic fluids are formulated to maintain viscosity at higher temperatures. These changes seem small individually, but together they mean systems keep working when older designs would have failed. A tank with reliable electronics can communicate, navigate, and target effectively. One with failing systems becomes a liability. Electronics and control systems matter as much as armor. Track design has improved. Modern tracks are wider and better at distributing weight. Some use rubber pads to reduce wear on hard surfaces, but those pads can be removed for better grip in sand. Suspension systems are more robust and easier to maintain. These changes do not eliminate the risk of getting stuck, but they reduce it significantly. And when tanks do get stuck, recovery is faster because crews can access and clear sand from tracks more easily. Track design reduces many common failures. Fuel efficiency has improved, which matters enormously in deserts. Supply lines are long and vulnerable. Every gallon saved means fewer convoys at risk. Modern engines generate more power with less fuel consumption, and better thermal management means they do not waste fuel just trying to stay cool. This extends operational range and reduces logistical strain. Fuel economy can decide whether an operation succeeds. Maintenance access is now a design requirement. Panels open easily, and tools are stored where they are needed. Critical components like filters and fluids can be checked and serviced without disassembling half the vehicle. This speeds up field maintenance and means crews can handle more problems themselves without waiting for specialized support. In a desert, where help might be hours or days away, that independence matters. Maintenance accessibility saves lives. Modern tanks assume they will operate in harsh environments. They are built for sand, heat, and dust because designers know those conditions are inevitable. The goal is not to make tanks that work despite the environment. The goal is to make tanks that work within it. And that shift in thinking came directly from watching older machines fail in deserts, where the ground, the air, and the heat refuse to cooperate. Hardening for the environment is now standard, which brings everything back to the one truth that never changes. The desert decides.
Always. Armor thickness does not matter if your tank cannot move. Gun caliber is irrelevant if your engine dies before you reach the battlefield. Firepower and protection are critical, but they are only useful if the tank can actually operate. And in the desert, operation is not guaranteed. Operation is the first requirement. The environment gets the first move. It attacks the machine before the enemy does. Sand turns small design flaws into mission-ending failures. A filter that is adequate in Europe becomes a catastrophic weakness in a sandstorm. A cooling system that works fine in moderate climates becomes insufficient under desert heat. Track width that is acceptable on solid ground becomes a sinking hazard in loose sand. These are not dramatic failures. They are quiet, mechanical, predictable, but they stop tanks just as effectively as enemy fire. Desert warfare teaches that mobility and endurance beat raw power. A tank that can keep moving, keep fighting, and keep running for days without breaking down is worth more than one with a slightly bigger gun or thicker armor. Reliability becomes the foundation of effectiveness. Without it, everything else is theoretical. A broken tank might as well not exist. Tanks do not fight landscapes, they survive them. Combat happens after survival, and survival in a desert means dealing with heat that degrades systems, sand that clogs and grinds, and visibility that deceives. It means accepting that the ground will shift, the air will be hostile, and the environment will test every component, every seal, every design choice. The desert does not attack suddenly. It wears you down constantly, and it does not stop. The battlefield is not just where the fight happens, it is the fight. Every meter traveled costs fuel, wears parts, and strains the crew. Every hour in the sun pushes engines closer to failure. Every gust of wind fills filters with sand. The enemy might never fire a shot, but if the environment wins, the result is the same. In the desert, the environment always takes the first round. This is why desert-capable tanks look the way they do now. Larger filters, better cooling, wider tracks, heat-resistant components. These are not luxuries. They are requirements. Because the desert proved over and over that machines built for one environment fail in another. And failure in the desert does not mean retreating to a base for repairs. It means sitting immobilized in open ground while your crew waits for help that might not come. The lesson is not complicated. It is just hard to accept. You can bring the most advanced armor in the world, the most powerful guns, the best trained crews. But if the ground decides your tracks will not grip, your engine will not cool, and your filters will not clear, none of that matters. The desert wins first, always. Only the tanks that survive it get the chance to fight. In the end, nothing about the desert needed to be learned twice. It never adapted, never softened, never adjusted to the machines sent into it. The change had to come from the other side. Power only mattered if it could last. Armor only mattered if the vehicle could keep moving. Firepower only mattered if the engine survived the heat and the sand long enough to use it. What failed were not plans or people, but assumptions brought in from other battlefields. The ground kept shifting, the air kept filling with grit, and the heat kept wearing everything down. Over time, control moved away from raw strength and toward endurance, reliability, and respect for conditions that could not be forced. In the desert, success does not start with machines. It starts with accepting the environment that decides whether those machines work at all.